Hello and welcome to Haman Nature. I am Adam Haman, and on this episode I'm talking once again to my friend Stephan Kinsella. He had comments about the conversation I had with economist Bob Murphy on a recent crossover about God and the nature of belief and the nature of knowledge and how humans act in the world and the nature of certainty. And we talk about all of that in a very interesting way, I think you'll find, so please enjoy.
Haman Nature, a journey in search of a peaceful and prosperous society with human nature as a guide. Led by your host, Adam Haman.
Hello, Stephan.
Hello, Adam.
It is great to see you after not so long.
I know.
We were just both on the Tom Woods cruise. I was so glad that you decided to come aboard that. You had a great time, right?
Me too. It was, it was really good for me. I needed it at this point in my life. I had a rough year, and all my friends were in town, and I had FOMO creeping in, and I really enjoyed it. Plus, I wasn't speaking, which I can always enjoy something better when I'm not speaking. Just enjoyed it, hanging out with my buddies. You all came to my house. You got to meet my wife, so I got further proof that I have a wife.
That's right. We've been speculating, but you either hired a great actress or you...
I've had, over the years, people wonder if I had a wife because I always go to these conferences without her. But over the years, on occasion, like Tom Woods or Guido Holzman would come to Houston and stay at my house, and they'd say, oh, there's proof. But it wasn't until 2018 when Mises Institute had their 35th anniversary thing in New York City, and my wife likes New York City, so I was able to coach her into going to that. And she did come to one Soho Forum thing, her and my son, to hear me debate at Gene Epstein's thing. And now she's going to the Giant Bhandari thing I'm speaking at in Vancouver in August, because she had to go there anyway for work, to Whistler. So she's going to come with me and Greg and Joy. So she will come to another libertarian thing.
Positive.
Might be making a little progress with her. I don't know.
All right. Well, it's great to have you back on my little show here. It's a weird recording cycle, but you're going to come on right after I had you on previously to talk about your intellectual career and your lawyerly career. And the reason is because you saw or heard the conversation I had with Bob Murphy about God and belief and atheism, and I was basically just asking him a bunch of questions about his journey and providing a little bit of pushback. But you heard that and wanted to take me to task for not going hard enough or something or other. So I thought we'd do it on air and flesh things out in a thorough way.
Yeah, and to be clear, you're joking, I think, but I wasn't taking you to task. We were just privately. I was just expressing some of my my own take on the theism debate, really. And,
if you don't if you don't mind, can we just start right at the beginning? With your own journey in this field, what you thought as a young man and how that changed.
I can, and we're fellow atheists, I believe, if I'm not correct. And by the way, I've hardly ever spoken about this, not because I'm worried about it, but I try to speak about things I know something about. And no one's ever asked me to speak on theology and even philosophy that much. But hey, I've actually always been disappointed in the way that this issue is discussed. So I've developed my own views, and so that's what we're going to talk about. I was raised very conservative, not conservative, a Catholic in Louisiana. I was adopted, and one reason I'm glad I was adopted is my birth mother was Protestant, and I really would not have wanted to have been raised Protestant. I've developed a deep antipathy towards not Protestantism per se, but fundamentalism especially,
right.
which there is some in Louisiana is a Christian state, and I think the northern half is more kind of redneck Protestant type, a fundamentalist type, Baptist type, whatever. The South is heavily French and Catholic, and I was raised Catholic. I went to Catholic schools for 12 years. St. George Elementary in Baton Rouge, and then Catholic High in Baton Rouge. and I loved it. I was an altar boy. We went to church we went to mass every Sunday. I took it seriously. I was interested in the theology, until I wasn't, right. So I was devout, but I also questioned things, and I had this really interesting religion professor at St. George named Mr. Jim Owens, who has since passed, that he was subsequently the principal. Very interesting guy, and he had us thinking about things hard in religion class. And surprisingly, this is Louisiana, which is a conservative state. This was in the 70s, and I was taught evolution was true. I was taught that the Old Testament was only that you don't have to believe it's literally true. You can take it figuratively. So I was always mystified later at fundamentalists and even Catholics who seem to have this kind of literalist view of things. You would think Louisiana is a backward state, but hey, I was taught that evolution is true. So I never had a problem with it for those reasons. But I remember, and this is right before I started reading Ayn Rand, a librarian in Catholic high school suggested I read that in 10th or 11th grade. And that started making me become a libertarian, but also more philosophical and more of a hardened atheist. But by that point, I was already becoming a non-believer, because I remember I used to argue with my Protestant cousins and people, and I just thought Protestantism was so ridiculous because you're missing a lot of the aspects of the Christian church, of the Catholic Church. Like, how do they even know how many books are in the Bible? Because if you don't believe the church was guided by the Holy Spirit inerrantly in choosing the canon, you don't even know what the Bible is. But at least the Catholic Church, they believe, well, Jesus anointed the first pope, Peter, and then there's a line of popes, and then the Holy Spirit was there for 200 or 300 years, helping the church select which books are going to be in the Bible, helping the people write the Bible without error, and then helping the church preserve it after that. So to me, it makes sense. The Catholic view made sense if you're a Christian. In any case, I remember I was mowing the lawn. My parents had a 4-acre farm pasture kind of thing, and I used to Saturday mornings mow this lawn, and it would take. I was on a Gravely tractor, so it would take 3 or 4 hours. And
wow,
in Louisiana sun, now we have snappers and better lawnmowers, but back then I had a tractor. But anyway, I remember I was puzzling over something, and it was about the hell issue. And I just kept wondering, how can a finite amount of sin that you commit in your life justify a good God sending you to hell forever? To my mind, it didn't match. There was a mismatch between infinite punishment, and even Hitler only did a finite amount of evil. You know what I mean? And so I started thinking, well, that just can't be right. Either there's not a good God, or there's a good God and he wouldn't do that. Because it'd be better not to have been born than to have been born when God knows you're going to commit sin and go to hell. Like, why would God bring you into existence in the first place? So, but I thought, but if I doubt that, then everything might fall apart. So, but I said, well, fuck it, I'm going to doubt that. So I started doubting hell. But as soon as I did that, then I thought to myself, well, wait a minute. How do I know Christianity is the right one, or Catholicism is the right one, or that Jesus is even real? And I remember I had a brief moment in my head, probably in the same lawn mowing experience. And I thought, well, if I'm going to doubt hell, do I even know Jesus really was what they say? And then as soon as I started thinking like that, it all just fell apart, like within 5 minutes in my mind.
So you're telling me that you were a good Christian, and then you got heat stroke, and it all just went away?
Yeah, I didn't think of it that way, but that could be what happened. So I stopped going to church with my parents, and I just became an atheist. And then reading Rand, I think, reinforced it. And of course, listened to all the debates. I've read a lot of stuff on it. Probably the best thing I've read on it, the one I agree with most, would be George Smith's book, Atheism, The Case Against God. Although even I have a few problems with, but I think he's the closest to being the right way to look at it. And I will say that I was kind of I would say I was, for many years, I would argue with people. I was sort of the asshole atheist. I think I'm less of an asshole. I'm probably still an asshole, but not an asshole atheist. But I'm much more tolerant of religion now and compassionate about it, and see there's good, like you mentioned in your talk, And I think like even Ayn Rand, said there's good things that are transmitted under the cover of religion, because that's the way you get an idea to spread. It has to have some value. So I think it does encode some values. And my personal view is, if you're going to have a religion, a traditional religion is far better than what the substitute is for most people, which is state worship, right?
Right.
Which is what the atheists and secularists really are. They worship the god of government. I'd much rather worship what we think of as the real God, which at least has some permanent values as part of that. And I do think there's a good Tom Woods episode from a few years back. It was like something like, "Do you have to be a dummy to believe in God, or are you a dummy?" And I think I took that to heart, because I do think that the way we simplify and caricature and blow off the arguments of theists is sometimes a little bit brusque and unfair. I do think there's probably more to it, especially the sophisticated ones like from Thomas Aquinas and people like that. But in the end, I think they're all still flawed. And as I mentioned, maybe on the cruise, I came up with my own argument for God, which I've never heard anyone make, which I still think is closest to being persuasive, but I don't want to reveal it because I'm afraid people will listen to it and I'll start a new religion.
And you don't want to start a new religion? Come on, man. Just for the tax breaks alone.
Well, maybe on this episode, if we get to it, I'll give you my theory, and everyone will say, "Oh, that wasn't that good of an idea." But so that's where I am. But my approach to it, which we can get into, is like, I think what I disagreed with you on was when you were like, I think you said something like, it was how you defined atheism, and like you said, well, I don't know there's not a God, I just don't have the belief, or something like that. And
I was reading over, because you mentioned George Smith to me in our text back and forth, and I asked Grok about him,
right?
Because Grok is the font of all knowledge,
right?
And he sounds like he sounds quite compatible with me, at least his weak form of atheism.
Correct.
Which is that he sees no compelling argument to make him believe in a God, but he's not going out on a limb and saying, "I know for sure that there is no God."
Correct.
And the way I phrase that is, that's a claim to a type of omniscience that I don't have.
Correct.
I don't have access to. So
right. Which I don't agree with. I don't think it's a claim to omniscience. It's not necessarily a claim to omniscience to say that there's not a God. I mean, you can debate it, but I don't think it's necessarily a claim to omniscience. But that's because of my Randian view of knowledge, which we can.
Well, let me. Let's please do. But let me frame it thusly. I remember the Tom Woods episode you're talking about. You don't have to be a dummy to believe in God. So I looked up Thomas Aquinas' 5 basic arguments.
Right.
And it all is very similar to, there must be a prime mover to keep, not only have started everything, Big Bang style, but to even now keep things in motion.
Right.
And a bunch of similar arguments like that. And I don't think you can sit in your armchair and logic yourself into a belief in something like a God. I just think there's way too much we don't know about how the universe works at all to make declarative statements like there must be a prime mover and it must have these attributes. In fact, it must be a being. That was one of Aquinas' declarations.
Yeah.
It must be a being, not a thing. And I just don't think we have anywhere near the visibility on how the cosmos works to say something like that. And similarly, I don't think you can sit on an armchair and disprove the existence of some unspecified thing. Now, what I think you can do is blow a bunch of intellectual holes in the claims theists make. I think that's pretty easy. But saying definitively, I know so much about this universe that I can, state declaratively that there can be nothing like a God anywhere at any time. I just don't think you can say that.
Right. Yeah, and I would agree with your first half about the limits of our knowledge and the problems with the assertions that we do know there's a God. I'm not quite as your second half. I have some quibbles with.
Please.
So let me tell you how I approach this. And I think you said you've read or experienced. You're somewhat familiar with a lot of Ayn Rand's philosophy, and I'm not
everything,
all of it, right? And everything. I'm not an objectivist. Well, I think I am an objectivist in my sense of I accept her four basic branches of philosophy. Not talking about aesthetics, although even there I think she's roughly right.
I think you and I are basically the same.
Right.
And I came up through Objectivism, and I think she went wrong here and there, but her basic structure, I think, is correct.
Right. Now, the Objectivists would say no, because they think that the way she applies it is part of her philosophy. Like, I think capitalism is what she means by individual rights in the free market, and I think that is correct, but I think it implies that the state is also wrong because it's aggressive.
Exactly.
And I wouldn't call it selfishness. I would call it, the rational egoism or something like that. But and I certainly believe in her epistemology. That is her view that there is reality, and that reason is the means of knowing it. So I agree with all that. As far as knowledge, and I agree with her theory of knowledge. So my understanding is, and it's probably simplified, but I believe that there are only two, it's two sources of knowledge. And one is reason, which is really the bigger category, and the other is experience or evidence, right? Which is why I think that she's a little bit wrong to reject Kant's or Mises' as a priori categories. I think that's just another way of using reason to discover something that's apodictically true, which is what she does when she talks about her axioms of the basic axioms. Those are not based on, they're based on experience chronologically, but they're the type of knowledge that you could never disprove, because asserting the opposite leads to contradiction. So anyway, that's why
I agree with all of that.
And I've always thought that religious people, they think there's a third way of knowledge, which is what they call faith. But to me, that's just a confusion. And you mentioned earlier about something like you can't reason your way into a belief. And I agree with you, but I think what's a lot of people think of as belief, they think it's volitional, that you can choose it. And maybe in the long run, you could brainwash yourself. But I think we can choose our actions, but we can't choose our beliefs, really, on a moment-to-moment basis. If you offered me, 10 Bitcoins to choose to believe that the moon is made of cheese, I would simply not be able to collect on the offer, because I don't believe the moon is made of cheese, and I can't make myself believe it because I don't believe it. So when people say God will punish you if you don't believe in him, I'm like, well, I can't help that I don't believe in him. So why would God punish me for something? I can see punishing me for committing murder, something that's within my choice of, my scope of action, but I can't choose my beliefs. I think your beliefs arise from the way your mind works and from what you see and how you think. So I think that there's only two sources of knowledge, and faith is not one of them, because faith means either believing in something for no reason, which to me is irrational and arbitrary, or it means you want it to be true, but they're conflating on, people say, how can you live in a world where you don't believe there's an afterlife? I'm like, well, because that's the world we live in. And what they're saying is, how can you accept that as true, because it's not a nice thing to believe? I'm like, well, if I pretend to believe it, or if I force myself to believe it, it still doesn't change whatever reality is. So I don't get this way of talking about belief as something you can choose. To my mind, belief, so knowledge is something that we have that is based upon evidence of the senses or experience and our reason. So far with me?
Yeah, totally. I was just gonna throw something else tangential. I think people talk that way because it's socially useful. Like,
sure,
believing in God is mollifying. And if you're, I don't know, raising a family or something, or just trying to keep peace in the neighborhood, maybe it's good to have mollifying beliefs. And so you just start to think, why would you want to believe something that 1 out of 10 people, it makes them just go absolutely insane?
Right, and that's fine if you don't want to be combative or whatever. I think someone sent me a post the other day. It was a meme, and it says or it's a quote from. Oh no, it was Jeremy Kaufman, because he said he was going to confirmation, and on Twitter, and I said, I wouldn't take you as a Catholic. He says, I'm a Voltairean Christian, and I didn't know what that means. So he sent me a quote from Voltaire, and Voltaire has some quote like, I don't want to believe in God, but I do want the maids working in my house to believe in God. Like, I think what he meant was, if you're kind of going to approach this simplistically, you want them to have some kind of value system where they think it's wrong to steal and murder. I'm like, okay, I'm fine with that, but it doesn't mean it's true. That's the thing.
Right.
So the way I look at it, and George Smith helped me look. So he categorizes people into, I guess, different types. There's a theist who believes there's a God, and then there's atheist. And I think, as you pointed out, atheist just means the lack of belief, atheism without theism. So in a pedantic kind of way, or in a simplistic way, even a rock or a dog is an atheist, or a baby. They're atheists because they don't have the positive belief that there is a God, right? I mean, he's pushing the definition, but technically speaking, they are not a theist.
It's really pushing it, because I would reject that.
Yeah.
Because I think you would have to consider the question in order to actually be an atheist, and a rock or a baby can't do that.
Yeah, I think when they use the word atheist to describe someone, they're talking about a rational human that has some types of views about all this. I agree with that. I'm just saying, if you look at the word etymologically,
sure,
both things don't have a belief in God, because they don't even have beliefs, you know?
Sure.
So a human that doesn't have a belief in God is without theism, so they're an atheist. But then Smith says, well, there's two types of atheists. I think he calls them passive and active atheists. And a passive atheist is someone who just says, I don't have a belief in God. I just happen not to be persuaded that there's a God. Like sort of like what you said. You're not persuaded by what you've heard so far.
Right.
And then there's an active atheist who would say, I actually believe there's not a God, which is how I would characterize my views. But even within that, there's different types of belief systems. There's agnosticism versus non-agnosticism. And most people use the word agnosticism to mean someone who just doesn't know, which is the wrong definition. By that definition, you're an agnostic because you just don't know.
Yeah, I wouldn't. I hate that word. I would never call myself an agnostic.
Right. So Smith says agnosticism just means your epistemological stance about our ability to know, or what we do know. And so I would say most people that claim to have an opinion about whether God exists or not, whether they're theists or atheists, most of them are agnostics because they think it's impossible to know for sure.
Right. Let me give a little intuition on this, because most people, they hear the word agnostic and they think ambivalent. Like, I just don't know. Maybe it's a 50-50 proposition.
Right.
And I definitely am not in that camp. I'm a betting man, and
right.
You would have to give me extremely long odds to get me to bet that there is a God. I'm going to bet the other side every time. So I don't believe words like agnostic because it seems like ambivalent.
Right.
I just don't think it's accurate.
And you think that, so where I would disagree is you think that if you were to say, not only do I think it's highly unlikely there's a God, and not only am I not convinced, and I'm probably skeptical that that we're ever going to be able to prove it, like beyond a reasonable doubt, you still think it's highly likely there's not one. You just think that it's some kind of pretense of certainty to say we know for sure. Because right. that would imply omniscience, which we're not omniscient, and I agree, we're not omniscient, and we never will be. And in fact, I think it's impossible to have omniscience, and the concept is contradictory, which is one reason why I think there's no God, because one of his characteristics is omniscience and omnipotence, which are all nonsensical.
Yeah, I do think you can sit in your armchair and say that's a thing that a being can't be. Like I'd be comfortable with that.
And that's why, but that would be a claim to certainty about there being no God, at least that characterization of it.
Yes.
So that's part of the problem is theists are very vague and all over the map about what they mean. Some people say the universe is God. Some people say it's a man with a beard. Some people say it's the cosmos. Some say it's the force of goodness. Some people say it's the force. I don't know. So the point is, you can't ever pin these guys down. And in fact, some of them take pride in that. They'll say, well, it's a mystery. And if you could define God, you would take away the mystery. It's like, so they're really, in a way, saying almost nonsense. And so by the Rand's view of certainty, she calls it, I think, contextual certainty. And that's because our faculty is a real faculty in the world. Our mind and our reasoning faculty and our senses, I won't say they have limitations, but they have a nature. And by the nature of how we acquire knowledge, we do it by getting the evidence of the senses from experience, and then using our reasoning faculty to integrate it. and to come to understanding of the way the world works. And that understanding is always limited by the context in which you're in. And so it's always necessarily contextual certainty. Now, the critic of that view would say, well, that just means that that you guys don't have complete certainty. But I think they're holding up a false alternative. So what they're saying is you can never know anything for sure because you can never have total, complete knowledge like God does. So, but they're holding up a false alternative, which is not even a realistic one, because knowledge always has to be contextual. It has to be based upon your experiences and the way your mind actually works in the world. So I think any knowledge we have is always contextual, which, and given that within understanding knowledge as contextual, we can form contextual certain conclusions about some things. We can say, I have contextual certainty that there is no God because given the way you've defined it, its characteristics make no sense and you've given no evidence for it. And remember, the only basis for knowledge is reason or evidence. If you can't give evidence, and if evidence is impossible to give, and this ties into another thing, she rejects what's called arbitrary assertions. You can't just say something is possible without a reason for it, because again, you have to have a reason or evidence to make an assertion. If I say it's possible that there's a purple dragon on the back of the moon, I don't have to say, well, maybe there is, maybe there's not. I think there's a 99% chance there's no dragon on the moon, but we can't know for sure. We can't know anything for sure, actually. I think the right response is to reject that assertion out of hand as being an arbitrary assertion with no cognitive basis whatsoever, no epistemological standing whatsoever, because they just asserted it. They didn't give any reason or evidence for it, and everything we know is contrary to that. So if someone says there's a God and it's up to you to disprove it, I don't think it is up to me to disprove it. It's up to you to define it, to justify your definition, and then to give a reason or evidence for it. That's why I say I believe there's no God, because the way I understand the concept as they define it, or as they kind of implicitly define it by all the things they say about it, it is simply, there's no reason to think that's possible. None.
I agree with everything you said about contextual knowledge. Of course, that word does an awful lot of work. You know, what exactly do you mean by contextual? Mm-hmm. And there's two ways to look at it, I guess. One is we can't actually be 100% certain of everything, but people tend to freeze up when they hear that. Like, if you're not 100% certain, then how can you act in the world, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And I think that's not true. Obviously, we do act in the world. And one way to think about that is it's just fine to go ahead and act, even though you're not certain
Correct.
necessarily about anything. That shouldn't freeze you up. What we know is contextual. If we learn new things tomorrow, we'll change our body of knowledge based on our new understanding, which almost certainly is also wrong or incomplete. And that's just how human beings operate. I don't think that's an impediment. My only objection is, I agree with how you define an assertion, and you should just reject them out of hand. But I still think you should leave a little bit of room in your epistemology for things that you don't know.
I totally agree. Yeah,
you shouldn't believe that there's that little purple dragon visible on the backside of the moon, but you just can't rule it out.
No, you can't rule it out because that example, there's nothing logically impossible about that.
Right.
It's just there's no proof for it. But there are some things that are logically impossible, right? And that's part of what God's nature is. Like even Mises has sort of an implicit criticism of God in the ultimate foundation of human of economic science and other places.
Well, I think you and I are atheists not only for the most extreme definition of what God is, but even what that chick was thinking when you were trying to get her into her pants in college about how there's some fuzzy God. We're all one, man. It's the one big universe. You want to reject all those claims too, even though they're not making claims to omniscience or omnipotence that are logical contradictions.
Yeah,
we don't have evidence for any of it.
Yeah, we can only take down one concept of God at a time because so we could name, say, 10 of them and have different reasons why each one of those is a flawed assertion, but then they'll just come up with the 11th. So it's hard to do a comprehensive.
Well, I think it's one takedown. You just say you haven't shown me evidence that I'm convinced by. That's true. But weak.
That's true. But so let's say that half of the concepts of God, I would say I'm contextually certain that they're impossible just by the nature of what it means to exist. Now, a weaker version of God, like you could say there's a very powerful being out there that we would call God because he's so far above us in every way. Like there could be a civilization out there that has transmuted into some technological powerful thing using AI and quantum stuff, and it would effectively be God in the sense of it could do so much that we would treat it like it would do what would appear to be miracles. Now, I would say that is logically possible. You haven't given me any evidence to believe that, so I'm not going to accept your assertion that that thing exists or even that it's possible without some kind of evidence or proof. But I wouldn't reject that on logical impossibility grounds. But I would reject other things on logical, because I think what I would say is, well, if that thing exists, it's just not God, because it's just another thing within the laws of the universe. It's like just a very powerful space alien. And it might effectively be God because it could kill us and it could give us things, it could do miracles for us, but it wouldn't be God that's classically conceived. So it all comes down to semantics and how the theist wants to define the type of God he wants to assert exists. And some of those, I think you can dismiss out of hand because, again, like Mises did, like if you say there's a God who's all-knowing and all-powerful and all-good, omnibenevolent, omnipowerful, omniscient, and omnipotent, all three of those things together, my personal view is that is impossible because for various reasons. Number one, God could never act. He's set to create the universe and do things, but according to Mises, if you act, it shows that you're imperfect because something is wrong with the plan of things. So the whole thing is self-contradictory. And not only that, I think it's just, from what we know about knowledge is always contextual. It just doesn't make any, for the same reason we don't know the universe completely, we never will know everything. God can't either because it doesn't make any sense. And furthermore, there is such a thing as time. The future hasn't happened yet. So even if there was a little godling who thought he was God, he might be wrong. There might be a God higher than him who's playing tricks on him.
Yeah, I agree with everything you've said. With, I don't know, maybe 99.99% of the certainty that you're expressing. So let me ask a weird question. Like I don't believe in the simulation, but I love thinking about it.
Yeah.
And part of the reason is just so I don't pluck my own eyeballs out if I ever woke up in a vat with a cable attached to the back of my skull outside of the matrix. I want to have the mental flexibility to just handle whatever this universe throws at me. So in a similar vein, I mean, what would you do if you encountered a being just like in Star Trek V who had all the attributes of God and all the powers, like, at least as much as far as you're concerned?
Right.
Would you just believe you're talking to a space alien, or would you think about maybe changing your mind about something?
Or if Jesus appeared to me.
Sure. Yeah.
Came back, something like that. Well, I don't think he would have all the attributes of God. He would have all of them because he wouldn't know the future. He wouldn't be omnipotent because he's acting. So he would have a lot of the aspects of what we call God. No, I would. So Occam's razor would lead me to go to the point where it's just impossible that this is God. Obviously, there's some very powerful being which is doing something in front of me I can't explain. But there would have to be a natural explanation, even if I didn't know it.
Sure. One of the things that I refuse to close the door on these things all the way is just the fact that I don't understand how anything works. Like, I don't really understand what space-time is.
Right.
I can't conceive of it. And sometimes when people talk about their vision of what an all-knowing God means, considering time, is they describe something like a multi-dimensional cube.
Right.
Where all things have already occurred, past and future are one, and we just can't perceive the distinction. And since I don't know how anything works, including quantum mechanics or I just say, okay, I have to leave a little room in my brain for
right. And and I think I think what you're doing is you're confusing humility and fallibility with all this, because the way, one thing I think is important to point out is that, see, sometimes the empiricists and the positivists criticize us Austrians who believe in a priori categories because they think that means infallibility.
Right.
And actually, Barry Smith has a great article on this about extreme, I think it's called extreme a prioristic fallibilism. So a priorism doesn't mean infallibility. It just means that if you start with correct conclusions and your deduction is right, then your conclusion is correct. But it doesn't mean that you didn't make a mistake, and you can always be on the lookout for, maybe I made a mistake.
Sure.
All you can do is say, so far as I can tell, given my reason, this conclusion is true. It's impossible for there not to be humans that don't act, because
I think it's important. I love what you said. I agree completely. I think it's important to remember that preamble, even if we don't always say it. As far as I can tell, based on evidence and reason.
And you can always say, and I could be wrong, because it's
exactly
be wrong. But the thing is that the theist and the positivist and the person who rejects this way of looking at it, they will seize upon that and they'll say, aha, well, you don't know either. See, the thing is, you said, I don't know. These guys talk about quantum physics and all this stuff, and maybe there's a supercomputer, or maybe we're in a matrix. Well, they don't know either. They're making this stuff up. I mean, I love science fiction. I just think I know when I'm reading science fiction, it's just a tale told by some creative author. I don't conflate Star Trek with reality, which I think a lot of people do. So I
actually think that's true. I think most people's, because we don't reason really. We come to our conclusions, emotionally and intuitively.
Yeah.
And I think before we ever had science fiction on TV or the books were popular, I bet a lot fewer people believed in space aliens than they did after Star Wars came out and Star Trek and, all the B movies. People think, people are influenced by what they see, even if it's just on a movie screen.
Yeah. And so I agree with your kind of humble approach in the sense of you're admitting that we don't, first of all, I think we can never know everything. In fact, I don't know what it means to say that's a false standard. It's impossible to know everything. It doesn't even mean anything. Knowledge is a category of action in the sense it's a practical thing. It helps guide our choices and our awareness of the world, but it's always inherently, I won't say limited, but it's always got a nature and it comes from somewhere.
Knowledge is a category of action. Is that what you said?
I think in a sense it is, because when you act, action is categorical. It has these categorical aspects to it. Like, it presupposes that there's an actor who has some awareness of the world and he's trying to achieve an end. But it's not just that. It's an important point I've made before in the intellectual property argument. There are two. Most people think of action as having one main component, which is the availability and employment of scarce means of action, which is what you use to achieve your goal in the end, in the future. But knowledge is the second part. They're both crucially essential and they're distinct from each other, because all human action is motivated by reason and choice, which presupposes some knowledge on the part of the actor. Knowledge about what the way the world is, knowledge about the availability of means, knowledge about the laws of cause and effect, knowledge that there is cause and effect and causality, and knowledge of the future. These things all have to be consulted when you make a choice. So all knowledge is the employment of a scarce means, but guided by knowledge. Those two things are both essential to what human action is. So knowledge is a category in the sense of you can't conceive of action without the actor having knowledge. Now, it doesn't mean it's infallible knowledge, but it is his understanding of the way the world works that guides his actions.
I agree with all that. It's just that since it's so directly tied to action, it feels weird to pull it apart.
Well, if you don't pull it apart, then you're left with intellectual property, because you start thinking, well, you own your actions, these metaphorical things. You own your actions, therefore you own the results of your actions, which is things that you create, which is where intellectual property comes from. Hoppe's book a lot of people haven't read it. He's got this little short 2-chapter or 2-section book called Economic Science and the Austrian Method, which is his attempt to build upon. See, a lot of Randians would criticize Mises because they think he's a Kantian and they think Kant is the arch evil of the universe. My understanding of it, after having read Hoppe and Mises and studied all these guys over the years, I think the Randians, in a way, get Kant wrong because, and it's partly Kant's fault because he is a murky writer and he's been interpreted by so many different schools of thought. But to simplify it, my understanding is that one school of interpretation of Kant on the European continent, the continental way, is realistic, and that's where Mises got his from, and Hoppe his. The American idealists sort of took it in this skeptical direction, and that is, so I think when Rand is criticizing Kant, she's criticizing the American idealist interpretation of Kant, and I think she's roughly right about that. But I think that there is you can interpret what Kant meant in a realistic way, which is what Mises does, in a pragmatic way, and then Hoppe went a little bit further in that little monograph, and he tried to explain where action is where the humans contact the world through their action and through their thoughts, and because action is a realistic thing in the world that is affecting things, because we're causing things to change by using causally efficacious scarce means, then action itself is the connection between our categories and our minds and the world, which is why a priorism in the Hoppian and Misesian sense is epistemologically realist and compatible with, I think, Rand's view. That's a long way of saying it, but that's why I think there is a bridge between it's action that gives us this connection to reality, not only through our senses, but through our acting. And in fact, there's a whole school of philosophy in German only, which I've only read some summaries, and I heard Hoppe talk about. There's a guy named Peter Janik. I wish more of the stuff was in English, or I wish there was no copyright so that the AI engines could easily just give it to us right away with a good translation. But Peter Janik has this real practical way of using Kantian sort of ideas to show that all of our concepts come from literally from manipulation, using your hands to interact with the world and building these concepts over time. And I think that's all a sophisticated and realistic and way of, and is compatible with Ayn Rand's realistic view that they would reject it because it's using Kantian terminology.
Yeah, I think there's probably something to that. If you listen to Jordan Peterson talk, he'll often say that exact same thing, that's how knowledge concepts enter our brain neurophysiologically.
Mm-hmm.
And, if you look at how, from being an infant, how we move in the world and act,
yes.
the sensory input,
yes.
the trial and error, that yes. does seem to be how we build the model in our brain of our surroundings and ourselves and our concepts. Yeah.
It's based upon human evolution. It's based
yep.
upon human experience chronologically and temporally in the world. And the way our minds work, the way our rational faculty works. And it's also strangely is compatible, in my view, with Montessori, the Montessori method, which we talked
sure.
about a little bit on the cruise. The Montessori understanding of the tactile environment and the way we have levels of planes of development, she calls it, among infants, children, different levels, different planes of development in an environment, a sensory environment that's suitable to your level of development, which is how our brain, I think this is all natural. It's just, there's no incompatibility between this stuff. Sometimes you'll have someone say, well, is that category logically prior to this one? And they want you to admit that one's like the Randians, they don't like dichotomies. They want to say that, there's
right.
no dichotomy between axioms or a priori knowledge and experience. It's all one thing. It's all reason. But really, there are different modes of understanding different realms of phenomena. Like in the dualism of Mises, we understand the causal world, which is what our action has to understand when we manipulate means. They're causally efficacious. So it's an understanding of causal laws, but also it's teleological. We're talking about the teleological world because we're explaining a human action that chooses among different means and different ends based upon your values, right? So there's different ways of explaining what a human does. You can explain him teleologically as an actor with choice and with goals and purposes, or causally as a cloud of electrons and quarks under the causal realm, but they're
Right.
different modes of understanding.
Yes, exactly. I agree completely. And tangentially, again, I think that's why your Tesla Model Y is going to achieve general artificial intelligence way quicker than ChatGPT ever will.
Yes.
Because
Yeah,
it needs to be...
robots or cars could be intelligent someday because they have peripherals. They have inputs and outputs in the world. They can manipulate, they control the world. They can do experiments. They can learn from their trial and error. Exactly. A computer never could. You have to have a body.
You need to be embodied, and you need to have desires of some kind.
Yes.
You need to be in an environment where you need to figure out, just like an infant, how to make your desires manifest in the world. And then if it's ever to be, it'll figure out itself how to become a general intelligence. And
I totally agree with that. And I'm a skeptic of this quantum stuff and also of AI. I don't think it's impossible to have a genuine AI if it's embodied. I suspect that we can only achieve that with a wet brain instead of a hard brain. And by that, I mean, I think you can't just simulate it with digital signals. The brain is wet, and you have to have enough resolution in the transmission of the signals between the neurons. In other words, I think you have, like, if you could build a positronic net, which Asimov envisioned, and you could train it, it could, and if it had a body, it could develop intelligence. But you wouldn't know why it was intelligent because it would just be like our brain. We don't know. It's just got this mushy cloud of patterns inside of it. The only difference would be that if it was electronic, you could theoretically have access to every one of its neurons, and you could have another computer analyze it. You could know, like, if it has a memory, you could see where that memory is distributed among all the neurons. Whereas our brains is too messy to see it.
yeah, that's really interesting. I don't know if you need... I mean, my intuition runs counter to what you just said. I don't understand why it would have to be a wet electrochemical signal rather than something we could duplicate digitally.
Well, but because I think that for the same reason that LPs have a different sound than CDs, because you can digitize the wave this has basically infinite information on that groove. You can digitize it with sampling to a very, very small degree so that your ear can't tell the difference if it's reproduced with a CD or a digital version, but it's still not a perfect reproduction. So I just think you'd have to have if it's a digital neural network, it would have to be so much bigger in terms of neurons than a human brain to achieve the same level of processing ability. So in other words, that's the reason. It's because the digital brain can only simulate the fine nuances of a wet brain, just like a CD is. I mean, if you ever look at the amount of information on a CD-ROM, you know what it is. It's enough to have an hour of music under the old format. But that's a lot of wasted data because you had to capture enough of that groove. But that record groove has, I won't say it's infinite, but it's a lot of data in there. Just inefficiently.
Just between you and me, Stephan, I don't think grooves and records are real. I think it's magic. I don't understand how sound can come out of a needle going through this vinyl. It's ridiculous. Come on, you're trying to tell me that's real?
Well, I will say one insight you just had is that there's not grooves on a record. There's only one groove.
Right. Well,
per side.
Sometimes they put a second one there in the middle. You have to lift the stylus and move it over.
Oh, really? I did not know that.
Because I just made it up so that I wouldn't be wrong. Yes, it's one.
You could do it. I kind of wonder why.
I think there was one record made that did have two grooves. If you were like real careful at the beginning, you could get one groove or the other. I can't remember who did that, but
yeah, I mean, usually what they have is the silence between songs. It's just like a 3-second.
Yeah.
Pause, but it's just the groove has no information. It's just silent. But for that part of it, I don't. This is a technological question. I'm not sure why it's not possible yet. I mean, theoretically, you could take a record up, an LP, and you could take your iPhone and just take a picture of it, because the resolution on these iPhone cameras is pretty damn good now. And have just a computer start playing it, because it could.
What?
I don't think the resolution's enough yet, but theoretically, you could just take a picture of it, and then you could play it from the picture.
Again, man, that's just magic. How does the sound come out? That's magic.
The sound is, well. The question is, how do you get a signal off of looking at the grooves? I mean, the grooves are wobbling, right?
I think I've demonstrated that I don't understand how it works.
Well, this is, the first one it was a wax cylinder, right, with Edison or someone.
Yeah.
So you have a stylus connected to a big, like a funnel thing, and he spoke into it. And when you speak into the funnel, it vibrates it, and it makes the needle jiggle. And as the cylinder rotates around, it etches a spiral into like a helical spiral into the outside of the wax. It will wax in the thing. But as it jiggles, it makes little perturbations of that groove. And when you play it back, the needle is affected by the back and forth movement of those little oscillations on the groove. And you use transducer to convert it to another form of energy that you can amplify.
I think if Thomas Aquinas had the ability to describe what you just did, that would have been a lot further in pushing me into thinking there is a God than anything else.
Can you tell that I really wish I'd stayed in electrical engineering?
Yeah, you get really animated. Yeah,
I know. I love
oscillations and perturbations and tubes. He's very excited.
Well, I mean, you've heard of AM and FM, right?
Sure.
Do you know what that stands for? Even the
amplitude modulation or frequency modulation?
Correct. But do you know, so modulation means a perturbation of a carrier signal.
Carrier wave.
Whether it's frequency or whether it's amplitude. And something can detect it. But they're detecting the perturbations, but they have to be perturbed in the first place. So you take a signal, like from a speaker, from a microphone, and that perturbs the amplifier that's emitting the signal. So let's say for amplitude, like or for frequency, let's say there's carrier frequency, and it goes back and forth away from that a little bit. Like if it's silent, it's just that signal, one sine wave. But if you perturb it, you deviate slightly from that, and then the receiver can pick up the amount that it deviates, and that's how you get radio transmission.
I mean, I'm tempted to just say I get it and move on, but really all that happened was I understand that when the guy in the funny hat says abracadabra, the rabbit appears, and that's how everything works.
I just figured this would have factored into your gambling skills over the years, somehow knowing something about modulation. Do you know what the word modem means, by the way? You've heard of modem.
Sure.
It's an acronym for modulator, demodulator, modem. I
did not know that.
Yeah, it's modulate the signal, a carrier signal, and then demodulate at the other end.
Yeah, all right. I'm starting to understand. Although I hate to give up my belief that it really is just fairies in there making it happen magically. All right. Well, I didn't really want to take up more than an hour of your time, but this was great, man. I think we're largely simpatico.
Just tell all our friends out there, because there's a lot of Christians out there nowadays among the libertarian court. You and I are the good atheists. We're pro Christianity or whatever in a weak form, in a weak way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it shouldn't be that hard. We're pro hierarchy of values.
Right.
Well, that's basically what a religion is, right?
If God exists and he's good, he's a libertarian.
I would think so. And he's rooting. He was going, go Ron Paul in 2008.
Exactly.
All right. Well, yeah, again, I think this was wonderful. I think hitting on contextual knowledge and operating in the real world with uncertainty, because we are analog creatures. I think that's all really good stuff and deep stuff. And if you understand it and believe it, you can operate in the world without being a complete neurotic.
So far.
An incomplete neurotic. All right, man. Well, thanks again. I really appreciate it. Why don't you tell people where to find you? You have a website and all sorts of good stuff, and you're on the X.
I'm on Twitter, NS Kinsella, in for Norman, in case anyone wants to know. And StephanKinsella.com is my website.
Awesome. We will put links to all that stuff in the YouTube video description and also on Substack. Thank you, sir. Pleasure as always. And thank you all for listening and watching to Haman Nature. Catch you next time.